So this is session 5 of Faith or Works. Yesterday we looked at what Paul said about faith and works, and today we're looking at what James says. Now, James in chapter 2 verse 24 says, "You see that people are justified by what they do and not by faith alone." So it sounds like he's contradicting Paul. But we need to remember the two uses of the word justify. One is to put right, and that's the one that Paul is using. The other one is to prove or give evidence of, and that's the one that James is using. If we look in more detail, we see that they actually are not contradicting each other. James 1:18, he says this, "God chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of the first fruits of all he created." He emphasises it's God's choice, nothing we do. God's choice that gives us birth through the word of truth, who's Jesus. That is saying that God chose to give us life, and he did it through Jesus, and that this new life is the first fruits of a new creation. So it's nothing to do with our works. Then in chapter 2 verse 5 he says this, "Listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has not God chosen those who are poor in spirit in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him?" Again, he's talking about God chose. But he also says that those who are rich in faith are to inherit the kingdom. And someone who inherits something doesn't earn it. It's just because they belong to the family or they're a very good friend. James' position then is really the same as Paul's. Being right with God is purely what God does for us, and it's based on what Jesus has done. But then James raises this issue. He says, and this is chapter 2 verse 14, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if people claim to have faith but they have no deeds?" And he gives the example. Say there's someone who is desperately in need of food and clothing, and we say to them, "Keep warm, eat well, I'll pray for you," but don't do anything for them. Then he says this faith is dead. And it raises the question of whether it really is faith at all. He then uses the same example that Paul uses of Abraham, saying it was credited to Abraham as righteousness because he believed God's promise, even though it seemed impossible at the time. But then he adds another thing. He says how God told Abraham to sacrifice his only son, and Abraham was willing to do it. And James says this, "People are justified by what they do and not by faith alone." But you see, it wasn't the action of Abraham that was justifying him here. It was his willingness to obey. He had such trust in God that he was willing to obey, even though it would have been a terrible sacrifice for him. That's that faith in God that proves, that trust in God that proves that his faith was genuine. We're saved by faith alone, but faith never stays alone.